Campus of North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce our program this evening by pointing out to you that we are commencing another year with you, and if you've been viewing our program in the past, we welcome you to that. If you're a new viewer, we welcome you also. I would also like to point out that this is our 7th year to be with you. This evening, it is a privilege to welcome to our program a guest that was with us once before some years ago, Dr. John M. Lanham, a medical doctor. Dr. Lanham was born in Nebraska and then came to Idaho and was reared in the hills of central Idaho. He is a 1952 graduate from the College of Idaho. Then he taught school for 4 years in the state of Idaho and then entered the United States Army, where he served for 2 years. Upon completion of that service, he attended medical school, graduating in 1962 from George Washington University School of Medicine. He then came to practice in Idaho and gradually became involved in Coeur d'Alene in the practice of medicine and was chief of staff of Kootenai Memorial Hospital until 1975. In 1975, he withdrew from the private practice of medicine over malpractice insurance and the question of bureaucratic red tape in the field of medicine. He now is in industrial medicine in the state of California. The purpose for his being with us this evening is to discuss a book that was published by him in 1977. The title of this book is The Making of a Medicare Doctor, published by Vantage Press, as I said, in 1977. We will spend most of our program this evening discussing this book and the whole question of a Medicare doctor and the involvement of our national government into the field of medicine and its regulation. Dr. Lanham, as before, it's certainly a privilege to welcome you back to our program.
Thank you, Tony.
Joining with me in questioning our guest this evening will be a regular member of the panel who is starting her 6th year and has been with us, I've indicated, for a long time, and it is Mary Lou Reed, and we're delighted to have you back.
Thank you, Tony. I can't believe that we're starting on 6th year for me and 7th for you.
It is certainly a privilege for us. We will commence the questioning at once, and the first series of questions will come from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Lanham, dropping out of the medical profession after 13 years of practice is a pretty radical step, and I think that you should start out this program by telling us what led up to this very difficult decision. What were your frustrations and what finally pushed you over the brink?
Well, Mary Lou, that's obviously when someone makes a step as apparently radical as I did, there are many reasons. The straw that broke my back, you might say, was the so-called malpractice crisis that occurred in Idaho. And all of a sudden I had to stand back and say, what is malpractice? How do I differ from newspaper boy on the streets of Chicago who pays a thug not to throw his newspapers into the gutter? And I didn't like the answer that I came up with. There were other factors involved. I found the words provider and vendor being used in my direction. And I looked on my diploma, and I didn't see where provider or vendor was, and I resented that. And all of a sudden my patients became, instead of patients, they were
clients.
No, the clients, that's the public health department's word. Consumers. And I thought, gee, when I'm sick and go to my doctor, I'm not a consumer, I'm a frightened person that wants some help. So all these factors came together, and then the day I made up my mind that I was no longer going to buy malpractice insurance, the law had been passed stating that in order to get my license in the state of Idaho, I had to buy it. So at that point, I told my wife, I said, when my malpractice runs out, that's it. And so I quit.
The words you're referring to, such as consumer, these are all new jargon that have come forth, as I understand it, through federal legislation with the Health Systems Agency. And were you reacting then in part to the bureaucracy as well as the new view that your patients and yourself were being seen in?
Yes, I resented an intrusion that I felt was unnecessary. I felt that within reason, I recognize that we all have to have limits, but within reason, I certainly was the best judge of what my patient needed. And all of a sudden, there were many people that seemed to want to help me in that judgment as to how many days they should stay in the hospital, or even if they should be in the hospital, what medicines to use, what medicines not to use. And this was part of the frustration. At the same time, I found myself enmeshed in the system that I didn't see any effective resistance. I was doing my bit, I thought, and others also, but in the overall battle, it seemed that people were more concerned getting into the proper position for the inevitable socialized medical system or national health insurance, rather than saying, hey, I don't believe that it is inevitable, and if it's wrong, I'm willing to fight against it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about malpractice itself. In your book, you say the question is complicated by, one, people want something for nothing, and two, the lawyers are milking the system. Would you like to elaborate upon that?
I don't think I necessarily say that the lawyers are milking the system. There are lawyers that do milk the system. I think that people are milking the system. I think that we're living in an age where that we are looking for an easy out, a fast buck, and this permeates our society. I wouldn't make a blanket condemnation of the legal profession. At the same time, I feel very strongly that if malpractice is committed, it should be that should be rectified. But we see more and more and more and more suits that really are being sued on the basis of poor results or expectations that do not live up to what the patient expects or has been led to believe is possible, rather than malpractice.
So you do feel that doctors do make mistakes?
Of course.
You know, the old line about how people feel when the doctor says, oops. Where is the patient in this risk-taking? How much risk-taking should the patient have to take on? Do you think the doctors are really policing their own ranks sufficiently?
This is always a question as to whether doctors do police themselves, and obviously that is really relative. As compared to what? Does the medical profession police itself as well as, let's say, the Senate or the congressman? Well, I think we come off pretty well. Do we police it as well as we should? No. But do we have the mechanism to do that? Because when let's say you have a borderline doctor, and if many situations come up where attempts are made, or if an attempt is made to curtail that man's practice or privileges, you find yourself up in court. So it's a double-edged sword, and doctors really don't like to be in court. They like to be practicing in their office where they've been trained and feel comfortable.
Okay, I think I better turn you over to Tony.
Dr. Lanham, it's so difficult in 60 minutes to deal with such an in-depth subject, and as it's put forth in your book, but we will attempt to do the best we can. I do want to get a little bit more background information. As I read your book, I understand you to say that as you left the private practice of medicine and went in industrial medicine, that this was a twofold problem for those in private practice, and we've alluded to that here, but let's be a little more specific. That first of all is the question of a state problem, as I understand it, state law and the like of legislatures and those serving in them to deal with the malpractice problem. And secondly, there's a problem in the national government with the question of nationalized, or what we often call socialized medicine, movement in that direction with Medicare and Medicaid. Am I correct in interpreting your book to say, in summary, that you found private practice to be difficult in that, first of all, that one is subject to so many suits for this high expectation you're talking about through malpractice, and that states have not dealt in state law with a problem as they have in some other fields with workman's compensation and so forth. And then secondly, that you were bombarded, as all people in medicine, with red tape and bureaucracy in filling out forms, or the whole question of ethics of how you treat someone and what you can and cannot charge in relation to federal guidelines. I'm first asking simply if this is a twofold problem. We will in a minute get more specific on what those problems are. But is that correct, that a doctor, as you describe in your book, is facing really a twofold problem here rather than one?
Yes, it is twofold, actually more than that, really more than that. But the pressures, you can't single out one thing. The pressure of malpractice, I was never sued, or as yet have never been sued. But pretty soon the fear of that becomes between you and your patient. Then all of a sudden you say, hey, is this the person that's going to wipe my wife and her estate out when I'm gone? Which does happen. Well, is this the case that 20 years from now, in light of new evidence, will come back and haunt me? Or on the other hand, here comes the bureaucracy at the state or federal level coming between you and me as a patient. And all of a sudden, instead of having a relationship with you, I have a relationship that's been encumbered by all these things. And it takes the fun away. To me, the fun was gone. And although I couldn't honestly say it was the malpractice or the bureaucracy, but all these things that came together. But it is a problem, and it will be different for each person that has to face it.
But it is true that in the practice of medicine that we're not dealing with one, but rather two major areas.
Oh, definitely.
At least.
Definitely, at least two.
And that from the political science viewpoint, can we say that one of them is being dealt with mainly by the national government? That is the question of what kind of aid is going to be available through Medicare, Medicaid, or maybe other programs.
Yes.
And then the other one seems to be pretty much a state problem, that is how states will regulate the question of suits within state courts concerning malpractice.
Yes, and we may see something of that from the national level ultimately.
Yes, if there's not an answer at the state level. May I now move into some specifics, and I think our viewers will be very interested in dealing with someone that is as candid as you are and that's been through this whole trip, as we may say. What are some of the problems that one faces in practice concerning the red tape aspect of the bureaucracy? Your book certainly is very clear, I think, in giving some examples of what one must go through if one is a very ethical person about what you can or cannot treat under federal guidelines. I know we cannot in this program go into great detail, but a couple of examples I think would help our viewers very much.
All right. Tony, I call my book The Making of a Medicare Doctor. That title was formed in a moment of frustration and anger, but let me tell you what I give you an example. Medicare came upon the scene, and idealistically, who can argue with that type of concept? I certainly can't. But the realistic end result of this, then people in medicine have to deal with. For example, Medicare, we see the big headlines of preventative medicine. We have a whole branch of government now, or department, aimed at health maintenance. And yet, Medicare does not pay for a routine physical examination on an eligible person, or a flu shot, for example. So you begin to say, what's really going on here? But the patient has learned, or was led to believe, or has come to believe, that it really does, that his problems for expenses are over. So the example I use in my book of the healthy 265-year-old people coming in with their Medicare card and saying they're going to have their first physical. Everything's done, and they're really healthy. And now it comes time to pay the bill. And Medicare doesn't cover that unless the physician makes some sort of diagnosis. It may be hardening of the arteries. That takes care of it. And so, I looked at that and said, what am I doing? And all of a sudden I realized that I was really selling my soul. And when I came ultimately to that realization and was willing to face it, no way. That was the end of it.
Mary Reed.
Well, let's go on with this. You feel that both patients and doctors have incentives to abuse the system.
Definitely.
And would you talk a little bit about how you feel the patients are overusing and abusing? You were referring to ADC, which I recognize as aid to dependent children, And DPA, and I'm not familiar with DPA.
Department of Public Assistance.
All right, so we're talking about basically welfare clients under the Medicaid. Right, how do you feel that both the Medicaid and the Medicare patients are misusing and coming in for treatment that perhaps isn't necessary?
Well, I think we have several problems here. We certainly have abuse of the emergency room. Rather than the incentive to find a physician on a continuing basis, it is oftentimes more convenient for a person who is not paying the bill directly to go to the emergency room where they can perhaps be seen sooner than they could be seen if they called and made a regular appointment. And particularly in after-hours situations, we see a tremendous amount of this. There is always the tendency for people to misuse and overuse something that they can perceive as free. And obviously, nothing in this world is free, although people are led to believe that it is. These are the biggest areas. I think that we certainly need a training, or people need training in how to get into the medical care system economically, and that can be difficult.
And you feel that the doctors overuse the system in that they have these temptations to sort of pad?
Yes, well, not pad. I don't like that word. I think that certainly I did. I won't. I'm not going to speak for doctors. I'm going to speak for me. I know that I had the tendency to utilize the emergency room as a convenience to me at times. There are other times that it was necessary because if I had a patient in labor, it was difficult for me to leave there to go to my office to sew up a laceration. So there's two sides to that story. I think that there is a certain amount of, if you want to, I don't know what you mean by pad, but there's a certain amount of excessive testing ordered by physicians simply to protect themselves. If you fall down in Safeway and bump your knee, I can rest assured that you will be taken to the emergency room and you will be x-rayed unless you sign a form saying that you refuse it, simply to protect Safeway, to protect you, and to protect Safeway from legal action by you. Well, that costs money.
And the doctor feels justified perhaps in putting in that extra bill because his patient is not going to have to pay it.
Well, that's
not going to be a burden on the patient.
In that instance, I think that's a poor example. The doctor charges for those services because he has to perform them, but there are often services that in his own judgment are really not necessary, but are necessary to protect him from liability. Now, well, I'd have to go back and recall your statement to go on from there.
Well, I think what I'd like to take it from here is a question to you that here we are in 1978. Would you do away with Medicare and would you do away with Medicaid?
No. I think that realistically, and what I pointed out in my book, I think that we need a catastrophic type of insurance. At least I've found in my time in private practice that most people that intend to pay their bills in the first place want to, and will pay their bills. It may be at a slow rate, and most of them can handle their day-to-day things. But it's the illness or injury or catastrophe that wipes out a family or has the potential of wiping out a family that I feel is definitely wrong. A disaster like that should not be allowed to do that. But at the same point in time, someone who is of substantial means, I don't feel that they should be on welfare. And if you look at it in those terms, that's what it amounts to. You can call it anything you want to, but that's what it ends up. And I don't think people basically want that.
Well, what about the question of the elderly, though? This is not catastrophic. This is when your time is reaching in and things are kind of falling apart. Body is really not up to things. And would you take away that aspect of?
You better dissect what they have. There's really not a whole lot to take away. And when you stop and think of what they pay each month, which now is up to about $7 a month, which you add that up real fast, 7 times 12 is what? I forgot, 84. All right, thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
I didn't major in math. And then you add to that the amount that is the so-called deductible. So the older person with his chronic illness will end up paying $150 before he gets 80% of the first dollar of the acceptable rate based on 19.6 back. So he spent a lot of money before he gets any service. And then you want to remember there is a limit to the amount of Medicare that is available to a person during a lifetime.
So you're saying it isn't really that good a deal. It looks good and perhaps it's soothing and reassuring, but the Medicare patient is actually having to invest quite a bit for that medical care.
Definitely. And then you stop and think that many of them do not know how to fill out the forms to get their money back. And if you don't think that isn't a problem, I would invite some of the people that might be watching this to call and let you know how difficult it is to fill out a form or get a form filled out so that they'll get 80% of the first dollar that they finally get back after use for a year.
If Tony will forgive me, let's tidy up this question with just one more question, which is, dealing with welfare mothers. Do I understand you to suggest that maybe the patients who are on welfare should not be carrying their Medicaid cards?
Yes, there are some, yes. There's no question about that. I think that to me, a welfare program should be geared in helping people get off welfare. And our welfare program is geared, in my opinion, to keeping people on it, because there is no incentive to get off. If they go out and make $100, that is deducted from their salary from their welfare check. So that if Junior goes and gets a job to help his mother out, he's penalized for it. And pretty soon, what the heck? Why not take it?
Well, I don't want to get off the subject, but in many ways, of course, the welfare question is a woman question, and I think that there has to be some element of compassion towards the woman who is perhaps deserted and is at home taking care of 3 children, who considers that to be hard work.
I don't feel that I'm without compassion, and I certainly do not disagree with you. At the same time, there was a tremendous amount of compassion and a tremendous amount of respect for that woman who was allowed to supplement her income without stigma or without a penalty.
So the rewards really need to be readjusted.
Yes, I think so. I don't think anyone wants to, in this country or any country, wants to see anyone do without or go hungry. I certainly don't.
That's nice.
Dr. Lanham, something else that came out in your book, I think very clearly, and that happens to be the whole question of the cost of medicine in this country in a general way, and that quite often as we become concerned, I think citizens have a perfect and legitimate right to be concerned at the tremendous rise in cost of medical care. But what is not oftentimes realized is that that's not under the control of one group of people, but rather is divided. And I would like for you to speak to this question of how is the medical care set up from the expense viewpoint. It's my understanding that obviously the doctor has a portion to play in this in charging his rate of expense for the care that he's given, but also then you have the hospital under a totally different management and their cost, and then the pharmacies and what they deal with. And I know that there's always going to be some inflation in the medical field as well as long as there is in other fields, but is part of the problem of the rise in the cost of medical care due to the fact that there are several components involved here, with neither one that closely involved with the other in the question of pricing?
Yes, I think that what you say is very true. And there's it's difficult to say any one group is at fault. I think there's a little fault that goes over into everything. Medicine is very interesting in that as you become more specialized and gain more expertise in the field of medicine, it becomes more expensive. Whereas in industry, if you learn to make 10 boxes where you only could make 2 before, it becomes cheaper. And so when you create the ability to replace a hip joint or to do arterial surgery, the cost of that equipment that allows you to do that then increases the cost of care. Now, I know what you're referring to specifically. Physicians, as they're trained, at least when I was trained, there were very, very few people that said, hey, do you know the cost of the test that you're ordering? And it's interesting for physicians to take a test of how much does a certain procedure that you routinely order cost. And we don't do very well on those tests. So oftentimes, physicians will order numerous tests that may be very necessary, but maybe they could get by a little less at the benefit of the patient. But this third party called insurance, or this third party called Medicare or Medicaid that's picking up the bill, is over there somewhere. So it's not so much concern, there's not so much concern for Tony Stewart who pays that out of his pocket. All right, that's a factor. It has to be faced. Also, the escalation of the costs within a hospital, because this equipment has to be paid for. The big fancy cobalt unit or coronary care unit, which is of value, don't misunderstand me, has to be paid for. So it's spread out over everything. But there's unnecessary competition between hospital and hospital so that a unit that is very expensive and very valuable is not adequately used. So there's the incentive to put the word out that, hey, we've got to pay for this machine. Now, people don't like to hear that, but that's a fact of life. There's the great push now to cut down the time in the hospital, where there was also, I've seen situations in which, and not in Coeur d'Alene, I will say this, but I've seen such situations, the word was out, hey, if you could keep your patients in one more day, the hospital would be in the black. So I don't think any one person is responsible, or one group. But I remember when this first broke, as far as cost and cutting back, it was very difficult for the staff to find out what a room rent was and how the hospital bill was actually broken down. But we ultimately was able to find this out.
My next comment is probably unfair to you because you're in one of the 3 areas, but I have attempted to interview several people on this subject because it relates to several things we do in our program here. And it seems to me that when you look at these 3 areas of cost, that the physician's charges are rather reasonable compared with the cost that one receives when one is hospitalized or when one goes to the drugstore to get the drugs. They're very, very expensive. And maybe I shouldn't even ask since you're involved in one of the 3, but it seems to me that if there had been more conscientious effort on the part of the major drug companies of the country and of proper administration of hospitals and cooperation in urban centers between the hospitals, that the cost would not have risen as rapidly in those 2 areas because physicians have not increased their costs at the same rate, it seems to me, as the other 2. Am I correct in observing this, that the charges seem to have gone up at a much rapid rate? That is what I'm saying. The patient who has to have all 3, he pays a larger percentage in the hospital care and in the drugs that he must take than he does from the attention he gets from the physician and those charges.
Well, Tony, I think you're very kind, and I'd like to think that you're basically right, and I think that what people do is that they lump medical care into one lump.
Yes.
If they have, let's say they have their appendix out, they lump everything. It costs $500 to have Susie's tonsils out. Mm-hmm. And then physicians, being very sensitive and somewhat paranoid, at least this one, I'm sure I would admit to a little of that, gets the feeling that the patient is looking at the doctor for that $500, where his fee may be $100 for removal of the tonsils.
Yes.
I'll use that just as an example. Certainly, when you begin to utilize, the more that services are utilized, or services are fragmented, so that the person goes from here to there for these services, the cost goes up tremendously. And as well as the cost as medicine becomes more sophisticated. I think the physicians have to share their share of burden for the rise of cost, but certainly the cost that wipes out a family is usually the hospital bill. The 30-day hospitalization with intense care. It's rarely the doctor's bill that is the straw that breaks the back.
Yes, and I think this is a point that's been overlooked in many of the books and the publications that have dealt with this question of rising cost. I want to give this one example. I know it's an isolated example, and those are always dangerous, but I think it has some legitimacy. I was interviewing a businessman back east this summer, realizing I was going to do this program, and he certainly is of the conservative philosophy and does not advocate government involvement in these type of things too much, so I think his point to me was a rather legitimate one. He was hospitalized for 10 days, and during that time with a back problem, it was advocated that a simple piece of plyboard be put under his bed to aid him in his recovery. When he received his bill from the hospital, there was a rather long medical term that he did not understand, and he, being the business type, inquired, wanting to know what it was. And he had been charged $15 a day for this piece of plyboard for 10 days. And he was very angry, saying this was an abuse. It was rationalized that the hospital needed this in relation to equipment and so forth. But I think there's something to look at here, and that is the question, maybe there's not in the major urban centers enough cooperation in sharing equipment and so forth. And if we do not tackle this problem of rising cost, it may be encouraging what you so much fear, and that is a more involvement by government in regulation as citizens become more unhappy with these type of examples.
Tony, that's a beautiful example. I'm sure that family would have more than willingly brought in a piece of plywood and put under that bed. I'll give you some more examples, and these are examples, and I'm willing to assume some of the guilt. I order oxygen for a patient, and 2 days go by and they do not need oxygen anymore, and I forget to write the order to discontinue oxygen. So 14 days later, when they're discharged with a heart attack or whatever, that patient has been charged 14 days for the use of that oxygen and tank and so forth. Unless a nurse said, Dr. Lanham, would you mind, we don't need this, discontinue it. Oh, I forgot, you know. Okay. And I'm sorry about forgetting. That's cost that patient or his third-party carrier money. But the hospital doesn't seem to be sorry. Mm-hmm. They won't say, gee, if it wasn't used, we'll charge by the pound or what have you. I'm sure that there are hospitals that would make that adjustment. And I would be willing to bet that man got some of his money back for the use of that piece of plywood. I would hope that he would. But these are legitimate examples. I think that, and part of this is a struggle for survival by the hospital. They've been limited in what they can charge, so they charge wherever they can charge. And to me, and I mentioned in my book, I remember the night that I found out that the drop of silver nitrate in the baby's eyes was being charged at 50 cents an eye or something like this. I remember because I sat down and dictated a long, frustrated letter to everybody that I knew would possibly read it, the administrator of the hospital, the chief of staff at that time, and I did that in total frustration.
For those who have joined our program in progress, our guest this evening is Dr. John M. Lanham, and we're discussing with him his new book that came out last year, The Making of a Medicare Doctor. We shall continue the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Lanham, you suggest that hospitals really do overinvest in new technology, and the CAT scanner has become sort of a symbol right now. It evidently costs about $400,000, and every hospital feels that it should have a scanner, and then many physicians are also buying them for their offices. How do you think hospitals can say no to some of this new technology, and how can they actually really assess the machinery to the needs? How can they plan?
Well, I think that realistically they can do exactly that. They can plan and, when necessary, say no. I don't think that a hospital or a hospital district is obligated to buy a new toy for a person. Now, that new toy, as a CAT scanner, happens to be a very valuable one. But it certainly should be utilized at its maximum. If that means that patients are to be transported, then that's what it should be. And I think you're finding more and more of this going on now. I certainly would not want one of my family not to have access to a CAT scanner in the face of a head injury. At the same time, I wouldn't expect my hospital to buy one in anticipation of that event. But here is where there is certainly good reason to have good realistic area planning.
Well, there are lots of things that are happening in our society which seem to be in part in reaction to these rising health costs. And I'd like to get your reaction to a couple of them. One is the holistic health movement. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
In which, as I understand it, there is a determination to treat the whole body, and the individual is cautioned that he or she is in charge of his or her own health, and they should not be delivering this to the medical profession. It's basically a preventive kind of a whole systematic or systemic approach. What is your reaction to the movement? I've only heard about it.
Well, I certainly don't have any objection in people being in charge of their own health and their own body. Obviously, it is their body and it is their health. I think that can be very constructive. And that really isn't new. I mean, I think anyone that thinks realizes that they are really in charge of how they treat their bodies. But people are more into this. It sounds new. It's amazing, for example, the movement of home delivery.
That was another example, yes.
The mortality rate that in mothers and infants that improved so greatly when the deliveries were taken out of the home into the hospital setting is now going back to the home. I have real problems with that. But the whole movement of saying, hey, I'm the captain of my ship up to a certain point, I better take care of it, how can I learn how to take care of it, how can I learn how to prevent disease, I think is very good.
Well, at the same time, we really are on very much of an athletic kick with the running and the jogging and the tennis. And is this not also another protest by society against perhaps treatment of disease after it's happened instead of setting things up in order to prevent deterioration of the body?
Oh, I don't really think it's a protest. Just stop and think. How many people enjoy spending $150 or $200 to go to the doctor to be told that they're healthy in their yearly checkup? They don't really enjoy that. If they hurt or if they have a laceration or a broken arm, they don't feel quite so badly about paying for that service. But now we are coming into a time where people are more personal health conscious, and they are willing to pay that kind of money. Certainly insurance companies were not willing to. And, if you have an extra $150, most people would rather go out to dinner or have a party or buy something that they can use on weekends. So I don't think it's a protest. I think people, most of us like to have some reason to have a cause, and certainly keeping one's body physically in shape is a worthwhile cause.
Well, I'm certain that people would prefer to put the money into health equipment and a tennis racket or into skis than to give it to the hospital.
That's right, or to the doctor.
Right.
Another question I think we should return to, we mentioned it earlier, and it certainly is a main reason for you to be here this evening. It was one of the reasons why you left the private practice and also why you wrote the book. And that is this question of malpractice insurance. And from what I've been told by friends of mine who are in the field of medicine, that some doctors in private practice who do not receive that even large income per year are paying out up to $20,000 and $30,000 a year in insurance to stay in practice and protect themselves. We also read stories each day of cases in court where huge sums are awarded, up to $1 million in some cases or even more. And I know that you've dealt with this problem, as all physicians in this country are very concerned. We're not addressing this question to you without prefacing it by saying that if there truly is a neglect on the part of a physician and carelessness, that we're not advocating that that should not be corrected. Even in some cases, maybe the physician to be removed from private practice. But it appears to us, from reading your book and from other research that we've done, that it's got out of hand as far as suits are concerned, and that we have to find some solution to this problem, or otherwise doctors will not be able to continue private practice as the insurance continues to rise. I know that you are very concerned, as your book indicates, in proposing some solution. My question is two-part. One is, what is your proposed solution? And number two, how the state legislatures of this country refuse to face a very, very serious problem, or they're facing it so slowly that it's becoming much worse before they deal with it.
Well, Tony, I think that, well, two things. Let's go to what's the solution. I don't pretend to have the solution to the problem, but during that time period when the physicians in Idaho were faced with the possibility of having no insurance at all, a group of us in northern Idaho spent a lot of time trying to work out a workman's compensation type form of payment for a medical accident. Now, that's different than medical malpractice, but as an example, if a bone was set and it was set properly, but for some reason or another, as it can happen, there is a malunion, or maybe the bone did not heal properly, and yet all good practice of medicine, the medical technique had taken place. Well, that leaves the person with a crooked arm, let's say, and a temptation to get even or something, whatever. And so a jury looking at that arm might award a large amount of money when really the doctor really didn't do anything wrong. The concept that we presented was that this would be evaluated, the patient would receive whatever treatment that was available, the physician would be reviewed as to whether maybe he shouldn't be doing that procedure, or maybe he did well. But there would be physician review, and this would be kept out of the courts. I don't think we have time to really go into the total package, you might say, that we were trying to present. It's summarized in my book. But that was the idea. Certainly not ignore it, but also if there were compensation to be involved, that it go to the patient and not to the legal system. That was another factor in it. I've forgotten the second part of your question.
And the first part was what you proposed to do, and the second part was why are those in government so slow in trying to respond to this problem with some kind of legislation?
Because it's a tremendous problem when you approach a person's right to sue. That's one factor. At the same time, there is a lot of emotion in this country that is against the type of approach that I would suggest. Also, as physicians have vested interests, lawmakers have vested interests, and the trial lawyers certainly would not be happy with that type of a solution.
Mary Lou Reed.
In your book, Dr. Lanham, you talk about your concern for quality medical care, and following from that, you are, to some degree, perhaps critical of the expanding paramedical professions, because you feel that perhaps they are not going to be able to handle the needs for high-quality medical care. Would you talk about that? It seems to me that we have a shortage of doctors, and nurse practitioners, midwives, some of these people who are able to do the simpler tasks would seem to be able to fill a gap.
Well, I'm back here 2.5 years after I left, and I'll be more than happy to address that question. You go back and look, and Sputnik went up, and all of a sudden our country was short of mathematicians, scientists, and PhDs. And so we had a crash program on, and we generated all these, and now we have a glut, or did have a glut at least, of this type of expertise. Same thing occurred in the area of teaching. When I started teaching, all you had to do was throw your hat up, and the one that grabbed it was, and that was it. Now, people really have to scratch to find their first teaching job, which I think is healthy. Okay. Now all of a sudden we have a doctor shortage, and we don't have a doctor shortage. We have a doctor maldistribution problem. But we're going to solve that problem by cranking out a bunch of people called medics, or paramedical personnel, or nurse practitioners, or whatever you want to. And now all of a sudden you're seeing in the headlines, and that's why 2.5 years later, saying, hey, maybe part of the problem of the cost of medicine is that we've got too many doctors. And that is, makes me feel that maybe some of the things, at least I said in my book, are true.
Well, do you think maybe these paramedics, though, can help bring down the cost of medicine? You were talking about how specialization really brings up the cost, and a doctor who has specialized 5 years out of med school obviously is going to be, that's a big investment.
I think it has potential for this. I think that paramedical personnel properly used and supervised, and this is what I mentioned is an area of concern.
The supervision itself.
That's right. I have no objections of a nurse practitioner taking care of certain disease processes, and probably can do a better job than I can, because she's got the time and patience to go into areas of instruction that really might be even boring to me. But if we create a subculture of medical personnel that is non-supervised, which I think we are and will, that scares me.
You're also rather concerned about public health programs themselves. Do you feel there is a need for public health programs?
Certainly. But I think that the implementation of Medicare and Medicaid have all been through the public health department. They just seem to be sitting there grinding away, waiting for this to happen, and all of a sudden the Visiting Nurses Association with 100 visits a year, etc., all came out of this area. And I'm very concerned, because I have the distinct feeling that the nurses that I worked with in public health that were taking care of their people really were concerned about their people. But the administration of that function that seemed to grow by leaps and bounds and duplicate and reduplicate and triplicate the same services didn't radiate that concern. They radiated a concern of maintaining and expanding a budget. And that bothers me.
You certainly wouldn't want to see private medicine take over programs such as early and periodic screening, or can you imagine doctors doing that outside of the public health program?
Well, I would, yes, I can imagine it. It could be done. I would prefer to see that the early periodic screening be one program, that not be intertwined, so that a person goes from a well baby clinic to a Head Start clinic to early and periodic screening clinic, and maybe a time or two to the doctor's office and then the emergency room. I think that we have so much reduplication of services that it's self-destructive.
Thank you.
Dr. Lamb, I know there's another area that you are very interested in, and before the program we discussed it, and I found your comments most interesting, and I don't think the public is very aware of that yet. And that is that some of the universities and medical schools are becoming very involved with the family practice specialist. And would you explain to us what this program is all about and your reaction to it?
Well, as looking back historically, the general practitioner or family doctor or whatever he was called a GP, was becoming obviously a dying breed. There was very little status associated with it, the status of that particular field, you might say, was going down. And yet this was something that people seemed to want. They wanted a doctor that would take care of them, that knew them as a person, as an individual, that was concerned about the whole patient and not maybe a particular part. And yet this doctor was going out of existence. So all sorts of efforts began to be focused on producing a GP, but that was no good. We had to have a different title. So they extended his training program, at least now, and called him a family practice specialist. It's sort of, I say this with tongue in cheek, but putting a velvet collar on a mule and calling him a racehorse. Because I am a GP, although I passed my boards, quote, to become a family practice specialist. And I've never been ashamed to say that I'm a GP. But there was a great deal of aura attached to this. Now, where are you going to train them? And so there was no place. So all of a sudden, the universities didn't want this, this animal that was a little of this and a little of that. But all of a sudden, the federal government said, okay, we're going to cut your money off unless you develop a family practice program. And so they did, reluctantly. Now, what's coming out of that? Well, you'll have to talk to the individuals, but what I see coming out are people who really are very narrow rather than broad. They're afraid to do surgical procedures. They're afraid to do orthopedic surgery, surgical procedures, or orthopedic manipulation of bones, or this type of thing, that most good GPs could do. And so I don't really think we've answered our problem. We've just created more people that have the name of specialist.
Thank you. Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Lanham, do you feel that there's a lot of unnecessary surgery being done today?
Well, you have to define what a necessary surgery is. Is breast augmentation unnecessary? Is plastic surgery unnecessary? Is the repair of a hernia unnecessary? Well, you could make arguments that all of these were unnecessary. If the question is, do people deliberately operate on people for money, I think that the answer to that, and no question in my mind, that is very rare.
We hear these phrases such as hysterectomy a day keeps the boat afloat. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that this is the unusual doctor who is perhaps going to perform a necessary surgery for the money?
No, I think that's I'll say this. I've always said that behind every unnecessary operation stands an unnecessary surgeon. But then I always had a thing with the surgeons, although I did surgery. I think there's a lot of things that are said tongue-in-cheek. I think that the hysterectomy certainly is an operation that has been overdone, as tonsillectomy was overdone. But I do not feel, in my experience, it has been extremely rare that I ever felt that a physician was doing a procedure just for money.
I ask this question because I think that the public really feels kind of at the mercy of the doctors, and they hear and read about possibilities of an unnecessary surgery, and frankly, they just don't know whom they can trust. And what do you recommend to a person who is perhaps scheduled for surgery and is unsure? Do you recommend shopping around for a couple of other comments? Is this something that the medical profession frowns on?
This is a difficult question. There's a great to-do about the second opinion. All right, let's say that the second opinion is no, the first one is yes. So now do we have a third one to break the tie? There's all sorts of shopping. A patient can shop until they get a doctor to do what they want. Or they can also shop to get a doctor to say, no, you don't have to have something. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I know I'm old-fashioned, but my family doctor, the doctor that I choose him because I trust him. And I think that maybe one thing in our society, we've lost faith in everything. What do we have faith? We don't have faith in our politicians. What do we have faith in? I think that maybe part of our problem in society is that we've lost faith and lost trust.
And the family doctor has always been the one who was really on the top of the heap.
That's
and to
right.
have the loss of faith in the institution of medicine is very unsettling, I think, both not only for the doctors but for the people.
Yes.
I think another issue that comes up frequently is the question of whether or not doctors do give excessive prescriptions of drugs. Are there a lot of prescriptions written out that are, as the surgery, unnecessary?
Well, again, as compared to what? I think that there's doctors are people, and doctors are different. Some people will treat a cold with assurance and maybe some home remedies, and I have nothing against that. Other doctors might write a prescription for a cough medication or a decongestant. Now, there's a prescription. Is it unnecessary? I don't know. I think it would be extremely rare that a doctor would write intentionally more prescriptions than he felt that were necessary, although I'm sure it does occur accidentally. The pharmacist, I think you find in this day that the price of medicine is really quite reasonable. But the doctor has to be a little careful of what he prescribes and know what that medicine costs, because oftentimes he can write a pill that costs 10 cents as compared to a pill that costs $1. They may be different drugs, but one is equally as effective.
But the question in the patient's mind may be, is he writing a prescription because he doesn't know what's wrong with me and he just wants to get rid of me? And I want you to speak to that unease.
What this amounts to is the doctor allowing the patient to be a part of the program. And many of us did not do that well, or as well as we should. I feel that a patient, if I'm going to treat you with a medication, I want you to have at least a superficial knowledge of what you have and why I think the medicine is necessary for you to take. And I hope that I always did that. Some people want to know more than others, and sometimes you don't have as much time to give that person that information. And so a communication problem comes up. But if I'm going to take a medicine, I want to know a little bit about it, and I want to know why he's given it to me and what to expect from it. And I would want to do that also for my patients.
And you feel the patient deserves that knowledge?
Certainly.
That's very reassuring.
Dr. Lanham, I know that we have created a curiosity among our viewing audience. We've talked about you leaving the private practice of medicine and writing a book, but I think we should inform the viewers that you have not left the field, that you're involved in industrial medicine. We need not get specific with all the details, but you are still in the field of medicine, and I know from talking to you already you're enjoying your work. Would you make a few comments to our viewers about how one can serve in the field of medicine without doing one specific thing, in this case private practice?
Well, yes. When I quit, so to speak, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wasn't going to stay in private practice. I ultimately ended up, I worked for a large chemical company as an occupational physician, which is a whole new field for me, and really is a budding field in medicine. It gives me opportunity to see people. I have more time with them and more time with my family. It also gives me the opportunity to do some travel and to become involved in some writing and epidemiological type work, and I do enjoy it very much.
Mm-hmm. We have about 1 minute left, and I would like to conclude with one final question, and that deals with the young person who's in pre-med, and I'm interested in that person, and I know our program could be of interest to them, but what advice would you give them? Certainly, you and I have talked about fear is a terrible thing, and we don't want to leave the impression that one should be frightened and not pursue something that is of great interest to them, but what do they have to look forward to?
Well, let me say this. They're going to have to read the book to get my idea of that. But if someone really wants to be a physician, one thing that cannot be destroyed by the bureaucrat or anyone else, and that is the relationship that man or woman has with his patient.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Dr. Lamb, it's been a pleasure having you on our program once again, and we invite you back.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when again we'll be with you, and until that time, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.